Princess Valara stood at the tall window of the royal palace and looked down at the planet below. Earth hung in the darkness of space like a blue and green jewel. It was the home of her husband, Jake Morrison. She smiled when she thought of him. Their marriage 3 years ago had been more than just a wedding. It had joined two worlds together. The humans were young and new to space travel. The Zinthari Empire was old and powerful. Her people had ruled among the stars for thousands of years. Jake had come to her world as part of a group that wanted to learn about different cultures. Valara remembered the first time she saw him. He walked into the great hall with the other humans and his eyes were bright with wonder. Most visitors to Zinthar Prime acted afraid or too respectful around the royal family. But Jake was different. He smiled easily and asked questions about everything. He wanted to know about their history and their customs and even their food. Within weeks, he could speak their language better than humans who had studied it for years. The Emperor noticed Jake too. Her father Thalen was always careful about outsiders. He had ruled for 200 years and had seen many species try to take advantage of the Zinthari. But Jake showed real respect. He learned their traditions and followed their rules. When he made mistakes, he apologized with genuine feeling. Slowly, the court began to accept him. Even the oldest advisors who distrusted all humans began to warm to the young commander. Valara had tried not to fall in love with him. She was a princess and her marriage would be political. Everyone knew this. Her father had already spoken with her about possible matches with nobles from allied empires. But Jake made her laugh. He told her stories about Earth and showed her pictures of oceans and mountains. He described food she had never tasted and music she had never heard. When he looked at her, his eyes held something she had never seen before in all the formal courtship she had endured. He looked at her like she was just Valara, not a princess, not a political tool, just a person he wanted to know. Their friendship grew into something deeper. Jake began to stay longer at the palace. He took a position helping to coordinate between the human navy and the Zinthari defense forces. He was good at his job. He understood both military systems and could explain each side to the other. Ships that had trouble communicating before worked together smoothly after Jake helped them. The Emperor saw this and approved. When Jake asked permission to court Valara, the entire court held its breath. A human marrying into the royal family had never happened before. Some advisors argued against it loudly. They said humans were too young and too aggressive. They said Jake might be a spy. They said the marriage would weaken the empire. But Valara's father surprised everyone. He said yes. He told the court that the galaxy was changing, and the Zinthari needed to change with it. He said that Jake had proven himself worthy, and that his daughter's happiness mattered. The wedding was broadcast across 100 star systems. Valara wore robes made of crystal that shimmered with every color. Jake wore a uniform that mixed human and Zinthari military styles. Her father blessed them in the ancient way. Jake spoke his vows in perfect Zinthari. Valara spoke hers in English. When they kissed, the crowd cheered, and it felt like the whole galaxy was celebrating with them. Life after the wedding was good. Jake moved into the royal wing of the palace. He continued his work with the military, and Valara often joined him. She learned about human tactics, and he learned about Zinthari strategy. They made a good team. At night, they would sit on their balcony and look at the stars. Jake would point out Earth's sun and tell her about his childhood. She would show him the ancient constellations her people had named 10,000 years ago. But then things began to change. It started small. Jake would be late for dinner and apologize, saying he had extra work. He would go to meetings that he could not tell her about because they were classified. He spent more time in his private office with the door locked. When she asked him about it, he said everything was fine. He said he was just working hard to prove himself to people who still doubted him. Valara believed him because she loved him. But others in the court were not so trusting. Lord Cavern was the head of Imperial Intelligence, and he had never liked Jake. He began to collect evidence. Strange transmissions going to and from Jake's quarters, meetings with human officers at odd hours, files that had been accessed without proper authorization. Cavern brought his concerns to the Emperor. A formal investigation began. Valara was furious. She defended Jake at every turn. She told her father that Cavern was jealous and paranoid. She said Jake was loyal and that this was just prejudice against humans. The Emperor listened to his daughter, but he also had to listen to his intelligence minister. He ordered Jake to submit to questioning. The trial happened in a closed session of the High Court. Kavrin presented his evidence. Encrypted messages sent to Earth. Meetings that Jake had denied happened. Security footage showing him in restricted areas. Jake denied everything. He looked Valara in the eyes and swore he was innocent. He said the evidence was circumstantial and could be explained. He said he had done nothing wrong. Valara testified on his behalf. She spoke with passion about Jake's character and his dedication to the Empire. She said she knew his heart and he was incapable of betrayal. Many in the court were moved by her words. The Emperor considered everything carefully. After 2 days of testimony, he made his ruling. There was not enough proof to convict Jake Morrison of any crime. He was found innocent and cleared of all charges. Kavrin was angry but accepted the decision. Jake thanked the Emperor and bowed deeply. Valara felt victorious. She had defended her husband and won. That night they held each other close and Jake thanked her for believing in him. She told him she would always believe in him. She told him that nothing could shake her faith in their love, but something had changed. The accusations had left marks even though Jake was cleared. Some members of the court still looked at him with suspicion. Jake became more withdrawn. He worked even longer hours and said he needed to prove himself beyond any doubt. Valara tried to comfort him, but he seemed distant. He said he was fine, but his smiles did not reach his eyes anymore. She told herself that it would pass. Time would heal the damage that Kavrin's accusations had caused. Jake would relax again and things would go back to the way they were. She believed in him completely. She believed in their love. She believed that nothing could come between them. She had no idea how wrong she was. She had no idea that in just a few short weeks everything she believed would be shattered. She had no idea that the man she defended so fiercely had been lying to her from the very beginning. The attack came at dawn when the 3 sons of Zinthar Prime rose together in the sky. Valara was in the garden walking among the flowers that only bloomed during this sacred alignment. She loved this time of day when the light turned everything golden and warm. Then the first explosion hit and the ground shook beneath her feet. She looked up and saw blue fire rising from the city. The defensive shields that had protected the capital for 10,000 years were burning and breaking apart. Alarms screamed from every building. Her personal guards ran to her side and surrounded her with their weapons drawn. They pulled her toward the palace bunker as more explosions ripped through the sky. Valara tried to see what was happening, but smoke and fire blocked her view. She called out for Jake, but no one could hear her over the noise. Her heart pounded as they dragged her through the corridors and down into the underground command center. The bunker was chaos. Officers shouted orders and screens showed the city burning. Emperor Thalen sat in his command chair watching everything with a face like stone. Lord Kavrin stood beside him and for once he was not speaking. The screen showed something that made Valara's blood turn cold. Ships were coming down through the atmosphere. Human ships, dozens of them with Earth symbols painted on their hulls. They moved in formation like they had practiced this attack many times. Their weapons fired with terrible accuracy at communication towers and defense stations and military bases. Valara could not breathe. This had to be a mistake. Some rogue human faction acting without orders. Jake would never allow this. He loved her people. He had lived among them for 3 years. He had married into the royal family. But then she saw the ship leading the attack. She recognized it from pictures Jake had shown her. The ESS Valiant. The ship he had commanded before coming to Zinthar Prime. The ship he still talked about sometimes with pride in his voice. A guard stepped forward and spoke to the Emperor. He said that Jake Morrison was gone. His quarters were empty. A stealth shuttle had launched from the palace landing bay 30 minutes before the attack began. Long-range sensors tracked it going up to meet the human fleet. Valara felt something break inside her chest. Jake had left her. He had abandoned her to face this nightmare alone while he rejoined his people for their invasion. Every moment they had shared suddenly felt like a lie. Every kiss and every promise and every time he had looked into her eyes and said he loved her. All of it had been an act. He had used her to get close to the imperial family. He had gathered information about their defenses while pretending to be her husband. The trial made sense now. Kavrin had been right all along. Jake was a spy and she had been too blind and too in love to see it. Valara wanted to scream or cry, but she was a princess and everyone was watching her. She stood straight and kept her face calm even though inside she was dying. Her father looked at her with such sadness in his ancient eyes. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything. He just turned back to the screens and watched the human ships destroy everything his empire had built. Then something changed. The human fleet stopped advancing toward the planet. Their ships turned and formed a defensive circle around Zinthar Prime. Their weapons rotated to point away from the planet into empty space. Officers in the bunker looked at each other in confusion. This did not make sense. Why attack them just to defend them? Lord Cavern suggested it was a trick, but no one could figure out what kind of trick it was. The answer came when space itself began to tear apart. A rip opened in the darkness beyond the planet. It looked like a wound in reality, and through it came ships that Valara had only seen in history books. Krillian bioships, thousands of them. They looked like metallic insects, and they moved with a terrible purpose. The Krillians were supposed to be gone. The Zinthari Empire and their allies had fought them 200 years ago and sealed them beyond the edge of the galaxy. But now they were back, and they were heading straight for Zinthar Prime. The human fleet opened fire on the Krillians. Every ship launched everything they had. Missiles and energy beams and kinetic rounds filled the space between the two forces. The Zinthari defense fleet finally scrambled and joined the fight. But there were so many Krillians. For every ship they destroyed, 2 more came through the rift. The battle was turning into a massacre. The ESS Valiant broke formation and accelerated toward the largest Krillian ship. Its front section began to glow with a light that hurt to look at. Energy readings on the screens went higher and higher until they exceeded anything Valara had ever seen. She recognized the signature from classified files she had studied. A Nova weapon. The most dangerous technology humans had ever created. Every civilized species in the galaxy had agreed to ban these weapons because they were too destructive. They could ignite stars and destroy entire solar systems. The Valiant fired, and the screens automatically dimmed to protect everyone's eyes. A blade of pure light cut across the darkness and split the lead Krillian ship in half. The beam kept going and pierced 3 more ships behind it. The explosion lit up the entire system brighter than all 3 suns combined. Krillian ships near the blast were vaporized instantly. Others tumbled away damaged and burning. Valara stared at the screen and knew with absolute certainty that Jake was on that ship. He was controlling that weapon. He was the one making the impossible decisions about where to fire and when. The man she thought was a traitor was actually fighting to save her world. But why had he lied? Why had he not told her about the Krillians? Why had he made her think he was a spy when he was actually trying to protect them? The battle continued for hours. Human ships fought with a ferocity that shocked the Zinthari observers. They moved like they had fought Krillians many times before. They knew where to hit and how to avoid the bioship's weapons. They coordinated perfectly like they had been training for this exact scenario. The Zinthari fleet learned quickly and adapted to fight alongside them. Together, they slowly pushed the Krillians back. When the last Krillian ship was destroyed or driven back through the rift, an exhausted silence fell over the system. The human fleet held position with weapons still charged. The Zinthari ships surrounded them uncertainly. No one knew what to do next. Were the humans allies or enemies? They had attacked without warning, but they had also saved the planet. They had deployed a forbidden weapon, but they had used it to close a dimensional breach that threatened the entire sector. Emperor Thalin made the decision that Valara could not. He ordered communications opened with the Valiant. The screen flickered and showed the bridge of the human flagship. Officers worked at their stations, managing damage reports and coordinating with other ships. And standing at the center of it all was Jake Morrison. He looked older than Valara remembered. His face was covered in sweat and his uniform was torn. But his eyes held the same intensity she had fallen in love with. Those eyes that had looked at her with such love. Those eyes that had lied to her for 3 years. Jake spoke first. He called her father by his title and said he owed him an explanation. The Emperor's voice was cold when he replied. He said Jake owed them more than explanations. He said Jake stood accused of espionage and treason and bringing an unauthorized military force into Imperial space. Jake did not deny any of it. He said everything the Emperor said was true. Then he began to tell them about the real threat, the one that had been coming for years, the one that no one had believed until it was almost too late. Valara listened to every word and felt her understanding of everything shift and change. The man she had loved was not who she thought. The man she had hated was not who she thought either. Jake Morrison was something far more complicated than hero or villain. He was a man who had sacrificed everything, including his own honor, to protect people who were not even his own, and now she had to decide if that made his betrayal better or worse. Jake looked at Valara with such pain in his eyes that she could barely stand it. He said he did not expect forgiveness or understanding. He just needed her to know that every moment they shared had been real. His love for her was never a lie, even when everything else was. He had fallen in love with her the first week they met. Every day after that had been torture because he knew he was deceiving someone who deserved only honesty. But he kept going because the alternative was letting her world burn. Valara felt torn between wanting to hold him and wanting to hit him. She asked how she was supposed to trust anything he said now. How could she believe his love was real when he had proven himself capable of such elaborate deception? Jake had no answer for that. He just said he understood, and that he would accept whatever she decided about their future. If she wanted to end their marriage, he would not fight it. If she wanted him to leave and never return, he would do that too. He would give her anything except the ability to change the past. She moved closer until she was standing right in front of him. She told him the humans had a saying about good intentions paving the road to hell. Jake nodded and said they did. Valara said he had paved an excellent road. He had saved billions of lives and exposed a threat no one else would acknowledge. He had sacrificed his honor and his career and his marriage, all for people who were not even his species. That took a kind of courage she could barely comprehend, but it also terrified her. Because she believed him when he said he would do anything to keep her safe. She believed he would burn down the universe if he thought it would protect her, and that kind of love was dangerous. Love could not exist without trust, and he had broken that trust into 1,000 pieces. She did not know if those pieces could ever be put back together. Jake raised his hand slowly and gently touched her face. He asked what she wanted him to do. Valara closed her eyes and leaned into his touch despite everything. She said she wanted to hate him because that would be easier. But she could not hate him. She could only feel this terrible aching confusion. Jake whispered that she should hate him if it helped. He said he could bear her hatred if it meant she was safe. Valara opened her eyes and looked at him. She said that was the problem. He would bear anything for her, but he would not let her bear anything for him. He treated her like she needed constant protection instead of like a partner. Their marriage had been built on an imbalance where he carried all the weight and she carried none. That was not love. That was martyrdom. And she refused to be the reason someone martyred themselves. Before Jake could respond, an alarm began wailing through the palace. Red lights flooded the corridor outside the cell. A guard burst through the door without knocking. He told Valara they needed to evacuate immediately. The dimensional rift was opening again. She felt ice flood through her veins. They had barely survived the first attack. Another wave of Krillians would overwhelm their defenses completely. The guard escorted them both to the command bunker. No one questioned why Jake came with her. There was no time for that. The screen showed the nightmare unfolding again. The rift had expanded to 3 times its previous size. Krillian bioships poured through in numbers that made the first wave look small. The human and Xanthari fleets were already engaging, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every ship they destroyed, 5 more emerged from the tear in space. Admiral Carter appeared on the main screen. The bridge of the Valiant shook from weapons fire. She spoke directly to Emperor Thylon and said they needed Jake Morrison immediately. The Nova weapon required a human neural link to operate at full capacity. The energy output was too unstable for computer control alone. Jake had designed the interface himself. He was the only person who could fire the weapon accurately enough to collapse the rift without destroying half the star system in the process. Lord Cavern stepped forward and objected. He said they would be trusting their most powerful weapon to a man who had already proven himself a liar. How could they know he would not turn that weapon against Synthar Prime itself? Admiral Carter's response was sharp. She said Jake Morrison had already proven he would sacrifice anything to protect this world. They were out of time. The Krillians were adapting to their tactics. If they did not close that rift within the hour, the enemy would establish a permanent foothold. Emperor Thylon looked at Valara. Not as ruler to subject, but as father to daughter. She saw the question in his ancient eyes. He was asking her to make the choice, to decide if Jake could be trusted with the power to destroy or save them all. Valara thought about everything that had happened, the lies and the truth and the man who had loved her enough to destroy his own life. She thought about what kind of person would carry that burden alone for 3 years. She thought about whether that person would betray them now. She told her father to send Jake to the Valiant. Her voice was steady and clear. Thalen started to question her, but she spoke over him. She said she knew Jake's heart. Whatever else he had done, he would not fail them in this. She staked her crown and her life on that belief. The Emperor studied his daughter's face for a long moment. Then he nodded. He ordered Jake released and escorted to a shuttle. Then he added that Princess Valara would accompany him. Valara started to protest, but her father raised his hand. He said if she trusted Jake enough to give him control of a world-ending weapon, then she trusted him enough to stand beside him when he used it. And if something went wrong, she would be there to ensure he faced justice. His voice softened slightly. He said he would not have her spend the rest of her life wondering if there were words left unsaid between them. She understood what he was offering. A chance to face this together instead of separated by doubt and distance. The shuttle ride to the Valiant took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Valara sat in the co-pilot seat while Jake flew. Through the viewport, they could see the battle raging. Human and Xanthari ships moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of hasty but effective cooperation. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers against the darkness. The Krillian ships kept coming in waves that seemed endless. Jake glanced at her and said she did not have to come. Valara told him yes, she did. She said he had been right about one thing. She should not have to bear the weight of his choices alone. But that meant he did not get to bear them alone either. From now on, they would face things together. No more secrets. No more carrying burdens in silence. They would be partners or they would be nothing. She asked if he agreed. Jake looked at her with something like hope in his tired eyes. He said he agreed. Valara reached across and took his hand. She said no matter what happened next, they would face it together. If the weapon worked, they would deal with the aftermath together. If it failed, they would face that together too. She was done being protected and he was done being a martyr. They were going to learn how to actually be married instead of two. People who loved each other but did not know how to share the difficult parts. The Valiant's hangar base swallowed their shuttle and they were running through corridors toward the bridge. Admiral Carter met them at the door. She told Jake the weapon was charged and ready. But she also warned him that firing at this magnitude would create a massive neural feedback. The strain on his nervous system could be catastrophic. He might not survive it. Jake nodded like he had expected this. He looked at Valara and told her he loved her. He said she needed to know that whatever happened, his love had been real from the beginning. Valara told him she knew. Then she said he needed to finish this so they could deal with their marriage problems like normal couples. With long conversations and probably some very expensive therapy. Despite everything, Jake laughed. It was a brief sound, but it was real. Then he moved to the command station, and the neural interface helmet descended from the ceiling. It was a complex piece of technology that looked half machine and half organic. Jake placed it on his head and his eyes went distant as his consciousness merged with the weapon system. Valara watched the displays and saw what Jake was seeing through the neural link. The dimensional rift spread across space like a wound that would not heal. The Krillians continued pouring through in numbers beyond counting. The Nova weapons targeting system overlaid everything with calculations and angles. Jake's voice echoed through the bridge, distorted by the interface. He said he was firing in 10 seconds. The countdown began and everyone held their breath. Around them, the combined fleet pulled back to safe distance. They created a corridor of empty space aimed directly at the rift. The Krillians sensed something was wrong and began to change formation, but they were too slow. The Valiant's blade lit the heavens for the second time that day. This time the beam did not target ships. It struck the dimensional rift itself and poured concentrated stellar fire into the breach. The fundamental forces holding the tear open began to collapse under the assault. On the bridge, Jake screamed. Blood ran from his nose and his ears. The neural feedback was destroying him from the inside, but he held the beam steady. He poured everything he had into closing that rift. Valara broke from her position and ran to his side. She placed her hands on his shoulders and told him he was killing himself. Jake gasped that they were almost there. His body convulsed, but he did not let go. The rift shuddered and compressed under the assault of pure energy that Jake was channeling through the weapon. Space itself seemed to scream as reality bent and twisted. The dimensional tear fought against the forces trying to seal it, but Jake refused to let go. His whole body shook with the strain. More blood poured from his nose and his eyes and the corners of his mouth. Valara held onto him and begged him to stop before he killed himself, but he could not hear her anymore. He was too deep in the neural link. His consciousness merged with the weapon in a way that was destroying his mind and body. Then with a sound that was felt rather than heard, the rift collapsed. It imploded on itself and sent gravitational waves rippling across the entire star system. The remaining Krillian ships that had not made it through were cut in half by the closing breach. Those that had already emerged found themselves trapped with no reinforcements and no escape route. The combined human and Zinthari fleet fell upon them with renewed fury. Within minutes, the last of the bioships were destroyed or disabled. Jake collapsed as the neural helmet disconnected automatically. Valara caught him before he hit the floor. His eyes were rolled back and his body convulsed with seizures. Medical teams rushed forward with equipment and medications. They stabilized him enough to move him onto a stretcher. Admiral Carter knelt beside Valara and said Jake would recover. It would take time and the neural damage was severe, but he would live. Valara nodded because she could not speak. Her hands were covered in Jake's blood and she could not stop shaking. They transported Jake to the palace medical wing where Zinthari doctors worked alongside human physicians to repair the damage. The neural feedback had burned pathways through his brain. His nervous system was in shock. But both species had experience with neural interfaces and together, they slowly brought him back from the edge. Valara stayed by his bed for 3 days without sleeping. Her father came and tried to convince her to rest, but she refused. She had promised they would face things together, and she meant it. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss what had happened. Representatives from dozens of species argued about the human use of nova weapons. Some called it a war crime, others called it necessary. The debate raged for days, but in the end the reality was undeniable. The humans had saved Zinthar Prime twice. They had exposed a threat that could have destroyed multiple civilizations. The weapon they used was forbidden, but it had also sealed a dimensional rift that conventional weapons could not touch. The Council voted to grant Earth a special dispensation. The Nova weapons would remain banned for general use, but humanity would be allowed to maintain a small number for emergency deployment against dimensional threats. Jake Morrison's actions were officially recognized as heroic rather than criminal. However, he would be prohibited from ever serving an active combat duty again. The neural interface had damaged him too severely for him to safely link with weapon systems. Emperor Thalen offered Jake a formal position as military advisor if he chose to remain on Zinthar Prime. The alternative was to return to Earth with honor and recognition. But Thalen said the decision should be made by both Jake and Valara together. It was not something either of them should decide alone. He said this while looking directly at his daughter, and she understood the message. Her father was telling her that partnerships required both people to have equal voice. 3 weeks passed before Jake woke up properly. Valara was reading reports by his bedside when his eyes opened and focused on her. He said hey in a voice that was rough from disuse. She smiled despite the tears that immediately started falling. She said hey back and helped him sit up. He asked if he had missed anything important. She laughed and said only the complete restructuring of human and Zinthari relations and several diplomatic incidents and his promotion to hero across about 70 star systems. Jake made a face and said that sounded complicated. Valara agreed that it was. Then her expression grew serious. She said they needed to talk about what happened next. About their marriage and their future. Jake said he knew. He started to say that he would understand if she wanted to end things, but Valara put her hand over his mouth. She told him to stop talking and listen for once. She said she had spent 3 weeks thinking while he was unconscious. She had thought about trust and partnership and what marriage actually meant. She realized that he was wrong to deceive her. He should have trusted her with the truth from the beginning. But she was also wrong. She should have seen that he was struggling. She should have pushed harder to understand what he was carrying. She should have made it clear that partnerships meant sharing burdens, not shouldering them alone. Jake tried to speak, but she kept her hand over his mouth. She said they had a choice now. They could end the marriage and part as friends. They could try to rebuild their separate lives, or they could do the much harder thing. They could stay together and work through the broken trust. They could learn how to actually be partners instead of two people who loved each other, but did not know how to share the difficult parts. Valara removed her hand and waited. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the second option sounded harder. Valara agreed that it would be. She said there would be days when she resented him for the lies. Days when he felt guilty for the deception. They would argue and struggle. They would probably need that expensive therapy she had mentioned, but she loved him. Not the perfect diplomat she had thought he was. Not the tragic hero who saved the galaxy. She loved the flawed, stubborn man who thought he had to bear the universe alone, rather than risk the woman he loved. She said if they were both willing to do the work, they might actually build something real this time. Something based on truth instead of secrets. She asked if he was willing to try. Jake brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. He said he would like that very much. He said no more secrets and no more bearing burdens alone. He promised complete honesty even when it hurt. Valara smiled and said good, because if he ever tried to protect her by lying again, she would personally throw him out an airlock. Jake laughed and said the message was received. Then Valara leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. She said they were going to be okay. It would take time, but they were going to be okay. Over the following months, they began the slow work of rebuilding trust. Jake told her everything about the mission. Every detail he had gathered and every report he had sent. Every moment when he had wanted to tell her the truth but had stopped himself. Every night he had lain awake feeling like a traitor. Valara listened to all of it without judgment. She asked questions and he answered them honestly. Sometimes the conversations were painful. Sometimes they argued, but they kept talking. They also started seeing a counselor who specialized in cross-species relationships. The sessions were difficult but helpful. The counselor taught them how to communicate better, how to share burdens instead of hiding them, how to ask for help instead of trying to be strong all the time. Jake learned that protecting Valara did not mean lying to her. Valara learned that loving Jake meant accepting he would always want to keep her safe, but that she could set boundaries on how he did that. 6 months after the battle, Jake accepted the position as military advisor to the Zinthari Empire. He worked with both human and Zinthari forces to improve coordination and share tactical knowledge. The two militaries grew closer and began running regular joint exercises. They developed protocols for responding to dimensional threats. No one wanted to be caught unprepared if the Krillians ever tried to return again. Valara continued her royal duties but also took a more active role in military strategy. She studied human tactics and learned about their approach to warfare. She brought fresh perspectives to Zinthari commanders who had been doing things the same way for centuries. Her father watched with pride as his daughter grew into a leader who could bridge two worlds. One evening, Valara and Jake sat on their balcony watching the three suns set. Jake pointed out where Earth's sun was in the sky. Valara showed him the constellation her people called the Eternal Guard. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Jake said he had been thinking about what the counselor said about trust, about how it was built slowly through consistent actions over time. Valara agreed and asked where he was going with this. Jake said he wanted her to know that he understood he had to earn back her trust. He could not just expect her to believe him because he said he was sorry. He had to prove through his actions every day that he was trustworthy. He said it might take years, but he was committed to doing the work. Valara took his hand and squeezed it. She said she knew. She said trust was like a bone that had been broken. It could heal, but it took time and care. The healed bone would never be exactly the same as before, but it could be just as strong, maybe even stronger, because they both knew how precious it was now. Jake nodded, and they sat together watching the stars come out. The dimensional rift stayed closed. The Krillians did not return. The galaxy slowly returned to normal, though everyone remained more vigilant now. The humans were given more respect in the Galactic Council. Their warnings were taken seriously. Their technology was studied with interest instead of dismissed as primitive. And in a quiet corner of Zinthar Prime, a human soldier and an alien princess continued the slow work of building a real marriage. One based on truth and trust and the understanding that love meant sharing both the joys and the burdens. It was not easy. Some days were harder than others, but they faced each day together as true partners. Jake Morrison had lit the heavens with his blade and saved an empire. But his greatest victory was learning to trust the woman he loved with the truth, learning that he did not have to carry the weight of the universe alone, learning that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. And Valara learned that believing in someone did not mean being blind to their flaws. It meant seeing them clearly and choosing to stand beside them anyway. It meant building something together that could survive storms and struggles, and the difficult work of being truly known. They would face challenges ahead. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and new threats would always emerge. But whatever came, they would face it together. No more secrets, no more lies, No more bearing impossible burdens alone. Just two people who loved each other enough to do the hard work of building something real.